Well, the general theme of the portion of Matthew's Gospel that we just read together, there, chapter 18, verses 5 to 20, I have titled The Church as a Fellowship of Believers. Now, it might not be immediately obvious that that is what Jesus is speaking about. And I would say that that's because of the reference there to little ones or variations on that. So, of course, we first need to understand what is meant by that expression before we can launch into this passage. And this reference to little ones or little child here, that it refers to humble believers, can be seen from what Jesus had just said before that which we looked at last week. In verse 3 of the chapter, he said, "Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven." And then he went on in the next verse 4, to say, "Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So take that on board and then add into the mix that in verse 5 here he speaks of one such little child, and then in verse 6, one of these little ones which believe in me. When you put all of those together, it becomes quite apparent, I would say, that Jesus is speaking of those who have truly put their faith in him. So having said that, if you agree with me, then you'll see that the general theme here is indeed of the church as a fellowship of believers. But then there are two subheadings, I would say. There is, first of all, in verses 5 to 14, there's danger to Christians and therefore to the church through lack of love. And then secondly, in verses 15 to 20, there is danger to Christians and therefore to the church through lack of discipline. Any of you that love the Marvel comic films, you might see the title of the latest Thor movie, Love and Thunder, as a sort of subheading for this. But we'll look at those two issues in the order in which they're given. And the first then, danger through lack of love. And in this arena, Jesus first of all tells us how much the most humble believer means to him. He tells us that if we receive such a one, we receive him. And then look at the words that he has for anybody that causes one of his disciples to stumble or sin, which is what is meant by offend in this passage. He says, "It were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea." Now, although those words on the face of it might sound harsh to us, they are actually quite an encouragement to all of us that love Jesus. They remind us of how precious we are to him. But from the immediate context in which they're set, we can see that there's another thought going through here. Because the whole event has come about because some of the disciples, they've just been arguing about which one of them is the greatest. And the problem is when we think in those terms about how great we must be, or are we greater than this one or that one, the trouble with thinking like that is that we inevitably look down on others. The two go hand in hand. And so Jesus is being very forceful in telling us about the risk to ourselves if we behave like that. So what he's really saying is that we must welcome fellow believers into the church with open arms, as the expression goes. And of course this should almost go without saying, shouldn't it? If we are to love even our enemies, as Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount, then how much more should we love our fellow believers? And yet, Jesus clearly sees the need to reinforce that point. And if we search ourselves, we might recognise that we are indeed prone to this folly of not doing what is expected of us. Because that old nature will not be fully dead while we walk this earth, we will fail in many ways. That's a reality of life for the Christian in this world. But as loving one another is a key area in our witness to the rest of the world, remember Jesus' words in John 13:35, "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." So it's patently a key matter in our witness to the world. Well, keep that in mind then. If you remember that, if we then start looking down our nose on our fellow believers, then we are hardly loving one another. So if you ever find yourself thinking something like, I'm not too sure about him, he doesn't even understand that, whatever that may be, or if you won't have anything to do with another because, it's just something I don't like about them. Well, if you ever find yourself in that position thinking like that, remember how much the humblest believer means to Jesus. And then ask yourself if you can do any less. A bit later, in verse 11, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost." Jesus went out of his way, far out of his way, to save his people. He went to all that trouble at great cost to himself. So in light of how much trouble Jesus went to for these ones, including ourselves, how can we set ourselves up as superior to others when the cost of saving us was no less than for saving them? We are just as bad as them. Well, then Jesus does recognise that in the world there will be problems. He says, "Woe unto the world because of offences, for it must needs be that offences come." To pretend that we live in a world where there will not undoubtedly be those that want to lead us into sin is just foolishness. Because the world, as I was sharing with the children a little earlier, the world is not the place it was when it was originally created. And that is a fallacy that a lot of people either purposefully or misguidedly express. They think that everything is the same as it has always been. But everything changed when the first man rebelled against God. Nothing has been the same since. We humans, we have been opposed to God since that time. It's only been really through the will and purposes of God that there have been any that love him in any generation. Left to ourselves, we would all run as far away from God as we could. By nature, we despise the very idea that he should rule over us, that we are not the sovereign lords over our own destiny. Figuratively speaking, we would kick dust in his face and wave our fists at him. The world would be an even more chaotic place than it is now if it were not for the will and purpose of God. And so then for those that are called out of this world and redeemed through the sacrifice of God's own dear Son, through Jesus Christ, for them there is trouble in store from this world. that inherent nature, that inherent hatred there is for the God who exists, strangely enough, the world's not too bothered about imaginary gods, but for the God who exists, that real hatred overflows toward those that are associated with this God. But despite that being the natural state of the world now, individuals are not let off the hook. They go, well, that's just how the world is. It's not my fault, it's the world's fault. But individual believers are not let off the hook. Jesus said, he went on to say, but woe to that man by whom the offence cometh. So he's saying, these things will happen because that's the way the world is. But woe to the person by whom that offence comes, because we are all responsible for our actions. We are answerable for the things that we do. No one can hide behind the words, well, that's just how I am. You'll just have to put up with it. That's not an excuse. That's not a way of hiding from reality. But then in this immediate context, this is clearly connected to what's just been said. We are to ensure that we here do nothing that could lead others astray in any shape, size, or form. If we start to behave as if it's okay to discriminate between one brother and sister or another, then others will almost inevitably follow our actions, and we will pay a hefty price for that. We need to have impressed upon our hearts what Jesus said there in verse 5, and whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. We are to receive fellow believers as if they were Christ himself. And that, of course, is consistent with the Bible's teaching that the church is the body of Christ. So we must cherish one another. We must support one another. And we must carry one another if necessary. Let me give you an illustration. If you think about your big toe in your natural body, well, it might be bigger than all the other toes, but compared to the whole body, it's quite small. And so you might not think much of it. But if you have that toe cut off, you will have immense difficulty walking. And so likewise, we must not despise the humblest among us, because they are of great worth to the whole body, just as our big toe is of great worth to our natural body. But also, they are of great worth to Jesus, who died to make them his own. And so, having told us how serious this matter is, he again uses some very dramatic language about plucking out our eye or cutting off one of our members, a hand or a foot, as a means of preventing us engaging in such ungodly behaviour. Now, he's used this kind of language before. He used it in the Sermon on the Mount. Some people, they say, oh, well, then they spot something that's said in one place, in one account, and said somewhere else in another account, and they say, well, when did he say it? And did he say it on that occasion or on that occasion? But that's really a silly thing to ask. It's not at all a sensible question, because a teacher will use the same examples multiple times if they are making the same or even a similar point on differing occasions. And that is clearly the case here. Now, it is, cutting off your hands and pulling out your eyes. I mean, that is dramatic overstatement. But it tells us that we must deal with these issues very firmly. The way must be cleared so that we can love one another as we should. And that's what he's teaching us here. Another example, my mother's garden in her latter years. It was overgrown with weeds, and they were mostly stinging nettles. When I cleared it for her, which I can tell you was no easy task, I was actually amazed to discover, among other things, that there was a path leading all the way up the middle and out to a gate that I couldn't see before, that then led by another pathway to the outside world. But all that was lost because it was all overgrown with stinging nettles. Well, the thing is that if we are not diligent, we run the risk of something similar happening in our own lives and in the life of the church. Weeds, they easily grow up in an uncared for garden, and bad behaviours easily establish themselves if we do not watch out for them and deal with them resolutely. And then something else that Jesus makes use of on more than one occasion is found in verses 12 and 13. It's the man with 100 sheep, one of which gets lost and then has to be sought for. I expect we are probably more familiar with the time Jesus used that picture in Luke 15. At that time he used the imagery as a picture of a person being saved and how much rejoicing there is in heaven when such a sinner repents and believes. Well, the situation is similar here. It's not the same, but it is similar. He starts, as we've seen in verse 11, "For the Son of Man is come to save that which was lost." And so in the following verses, he says that having done that, having saved that which is lost, he's saying he's not going to let them get lost again. They may go astray, but the Good Shepherd is after them in a flash, we might say. Having paid such a price to purchase them, he's not going to allow them to be handed over to destruction, we could say. In this picture, the shepherd has left the huge bulk, the 99, he's left the bulk of the sheep, simply to go after the one. And that is the kind of care that Jesus lavishes upon us. And you can see, the point is that we must treat each other likewise. And not only should we treat one another with kindness, but we ought to bear with one another's imperfection. We should endeavour, when one wanders off, to bring them back to the right path. Because although it does happen that they sometimes wander, the fact is that they are God's sheep over which God has appointed his Son to be the shepherd. That being the case, we should ask ourselves what right we have to drive them away by our behaviours. Keeping a sheep from wandering off like this is a source of joy. Now, in this example, you might think, well, the 99, they might be considered better Christians insofar as they didn't wander off. But the fact is that it's the one that wanders off and is brought back is the one that shows us Christ's continual love for us. How many of us, I wonder, have begun to wander down some erroneous path of false teaching maybe, and we've been glad that the Lord has brought us back, Jesus has brought us back to where we should be. So we must never forget that Jesus is always on the lookout for us, and we should be on the lookout for one another too. And this is because, as verse 24 puts it, even so, this is after the reading we had together, it says, even so, it is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Now, before moving on, I suspect some of you are wondering what verse 10 is all about. It says, take heed that ye despise not one of these little ones, for I say unto you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. I'd be willing to guess that that's where the idea of guardian angels sprang from. But we have to bear in mind Hebrews 1 and verse 14, which speaks of angels like this. It says, are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be heirs of salvation? So with that added information, of course, we can't say that there is one angel for one person. What we say is that they all work together for the good of us, to do the will of our God. And the point then made here in Matthew, the point is stressing that we must work for the good of others rather than despising them. That's the general point there. That's because even the angels, which are in heaven, they are working for their good, and therefore we should be working for their good too. That's the point Jesus is making there in the 11th verse. So then, having described the danger that can result to any of us individually or the church as a whole through lack of love, Jesus then brings our thoughts to the importance of church discipline, which is our second point this morning. Now, we might not like the idea of discipline, we might not like it as it affects us, but we might not like it in any sense. And that's probably a hangover from our old nature. Now, you might recall, at the time you were considering calling me to be the pastor here, that I provided you with my view of the church, and among other things, I reminded you that the church is like a family. And in a family, there will or should be a degree of discipline. But I mentioned at the time that the sort of thing that gets conjured up in our minds when we think of church discipline is usually the end of a process in the most obstinate cases. That's the sort of thing we think of when someone mentions the words church discipline. But as I said, most discipline is invisible to the people not directly involved in it. And you can see that from verses 15 to 17 here. You can see it starts out with just two people. He said, moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. Now, if it's between two people only, and it does say alone, no, just those two people, then that part of the discipline process will be invisible to everybody else. Now, of course, we might ask, well, why is church discipline even a necessity? And to that question, let me take you back to my mother's overgrown garden for a moment. And as I've already indicated, the church should be a community that's very welcoming. As such, we would expect to see among us not only fellow believers, but those who are interested in knowing what we believe. And then from time to time, there will be some that come among us who come among us not for any good reason. And sometimes you get those that come for reasons that even they do not fully understand. But the core group, those who have committed themselves to love Jesus and love one another, they need to be kept pure from any that do not hold to the truths that we love and hold dear. Because although hypocrites may come and sit amongst us, if they become part of the church, then they are like those stinging nettles in my mother's garden. If they are allowed to stay put, they grow prolifically until the garden is no longer recognisable as a garden. Now, of course, like all pictures, it falls down eventually. It is, after all, only a picture. So Jesus doesn't tell us to start pulling up and casting out anyone that we are concerned may be a hypocrite at the first opportunity. He says the first thing to do is go and speak to them. And although I'm sure that applies more widely, in this context, the issue would be of not treating a humble fellow believer in accordance with the way that we've just been taught. And so the offended brother, or possibly someone that's just seen what's going on, needs to speak to the offender. Yeah? Do they realise how they are behaving? Do they realise the wider damage that they may have caused? Well, maybe they don't. And then when they are forced to think about it, they realise that they've come short of the mark and they turn from their behaviour, and the outworking of love is once again seen in their life again. Now, the thing about hypocrites is that they really hate being corrected or told off, as they would see it. But sadly, it's not just hypocrites that behave like that. It's something that we all face. Let me just remind you what I said earlier on, that our old nature will not be fully dead while we walk this earth. So as a result, we still find ourselves failing in various ways. And so we can respond negatively to anybody correcting us. You know, there is something about us that doesn't like the idea that they're correcting us. Who do you think you are to say that to me? Ooh, it burns up in us sometimes. Maybe we dress it up a bit neater and we say, oh, well, you know, you should live and let live. But as Jesus has shown us, individualism is no good. Because it wouldn't be too wrong to say that with individualism, it sets the boundary of love at self. Well, I only have to care about myself. I shall love myself and no one else. And that's the problem. That's why individualism is such a bad philosophy. Anyway, to those that do not listen to you, Jesus tells us to take a couple more people along and to try to convince the erring person. And then if they won't listen to them, then that is the point, and only then that you take it to the whole church. Now, these verses are not the only direction given to us on church discipline, but they do outline the process. And so you can see what I mean about it being only the most obstinate cases that get known more widely. And sadly, sometimes it takes more than just an individual admonition to wake us up. Sometimes it does need a few more people to tell us. But if we belong to Christ, we will eventually listen. If such a person will not even listen to the church, then he must be treated as an unbeliever. He has to be put out of membership of the church. But even then, he may still be a believer, but he has to be treated as if he wasn't. If he is a believer and then repents, of course, then he's to be welcomed back into the church. Now, like I say, these days we do tend to shy away from even the mention of discipline. Perhaps it's because we've seen it badly handled at some time or another, or maybe we've been infected by that philosophy of live and let live. But Jesus assures us that the church does have heavenly sanction for this authority. He says, verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And that was something that Jesus had said to his 3 disciples that had been with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. But here now, he says it's to the whole church. What Jesus goes on to say shows us that the church does not behave contrary to the way Jesus would behave. Furthermore, it mustn't be that one person is allowed to stand as a judge as to what is the correct course of action. He says that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything, then they shall ask, it shall be done for them of my Father which is in heaven. And then he adds, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So even in discipline, love must prevail. Everything must be done as if Jesus was doing it. Now, quite clearly, Jesus does not say that you cannot tell anybody that they've done something wrong. Now, that is increasingly popular these days. The idea is that you're only allowed to affirm what other people are doing. You mustn't tell them they're doing something wrong. You can only agree with them. But Jesus tells us an altogether different story. And we would be fools not to listen to him. And furthermore, of course, if we don't listen to Jesus, then there will be no church. And we can talk about love as much as we like. But if we do not follow Jesus, that love will be no more than a word. And so then, let us, as a fellowship of believers, we're going to now sing our last hymn, Love Divine, or Love's Excelling, which includes the words, take away the love of sinning. So we're admonished there. Well, let's do that then. Let's do that now. Let's sing that hymn, number 616.